KBLKradio.com.
We're going to have as our guest this morning is Pastor Ben McBride, and he's the Deputy Director with PICO California with a focus on formation and innovation. And we are going to be discussing combating racial profiling, dealing with traffic stops. Now, if you want to join us in this conversation this morning, you can join us today by calling in at 619-356-4705. Again, that number is 619-356-4704. And so we have an interesting report or study today, because today we're dealing with the racial profiling. We know that a report just came out in San Diego with the San Diego Police Department, the San Diego State University did. And one of the things that we found with the traffic enforcement in San Diego, California, and it's called an analysis of SDPD vehicle stops. In this report, it stated that 4.23% of the electronic survey respondents, these were police officers, strongly agreed that racial ethnic bias is a genuine problem for the San Diego Police Department. So that's less than 5% believe that there is a bias. So we kind of understand why the chief Zimmerman does not want to acknowledge that racial profiling exists. Now, in the interviews with officers, they sought to probe deeper into these beliefs. When SDPD officers were asked whether they would be surprised if the audit report found racial ethnic disparities in the analysis of the traffic stop data, the vast majority of officers, they spoke to expressed beliefs in line with the survey respondents, stating that they would be surprised if racial ethnic bias were to be found to exist in how traffic stops are conducted by the department. Now, the audit report data showed that in 2014, when driver race ethnicity was visible, black drivers were nearly 20% more likely to be the subject of a discretionary traffic stop than white drivers. When confined to drivers aged 25 or under, young black drivers in 2014 were 43.8% more likely to be stopped in daylight than after dark compared to young whites. Now, when you talk about mass drivers, they took about, I think it was over 19,000 black drivers and 19,000 white drivers. And when they were, and those that were subject to field interviews, when questioning, there was 1,203 times folks that were interviewed between January 1st, 2014, and December 31st, 2015, while only 552 white drivers were given field interviews. So that averaged up to say that during the same period, a difference of just over between black and white drivers getting field interviews under the same circumstances being stopped, and you take as many whites and blacks, it was over 80%, 82%. So blacks were subject to field interviews 2.4 times the rate of matched white drivers. The audit report found statistically significant evidence of a black-white disparity across all search types combined. And in 4 of the 5 types of searches, for all search types combined, there was an 8.65% of matched black drivers were searched in 2014 and 2015 compared to 5.04 of matched white drivers. That is a 2.90% of stopped black drivers were subjected to a fourth wave search compared to 1.30% of matched white drivers. Black drivers were also more likely to face consent searches than were matched white drivers. To a certain extent, these disparities were also evident in low discretion searches, which include inventory searches when somebody gets their car towed, and unclassified search types. So here's a fact. Black and Hispanic drivers were stopped more than their demographic profile would predict, while white and Asian Pacific Islanders drivers were stopped less for 2014 and 2015. So traffic enforcement in San Diego, California, this group that did this, the SDSU, and when they looked at the analysis of the SDPD vehicle stops in 2014-2015, gave 3 recommendations to eliminate racial disparities in traffic stops. 1, they said addressing racial disparities. That means acknowledge the existence of racial disparities and commit to combat these disparities as a priority. Continue to enhance training and supervision around issues of racial disparity, make traffic stops more transparent, make traffic stops more systematic and data drive. And then number two, the second recommendation was building stronger police-community relations. And the third recommendation was improving data collection practices. So it is estimated that officers comply with filling out the data cards 60% of traffic stops. Here's what one officer said about filling out the data traffic cards. The collection of traffic stop data is useless. Others called the process a waste of time, worthless, stupid, and a joke. These are police officers complain about doing their job. The officer survey response made the point more systematically. 72% of respondents either disagree or disagree strongly with the notion that completing the traffic data stop card is a worthwhile use of officer time. Several officers also reported feeling as though the data gathered would be used to unfairly portray their work as biased. As one officer put it, regardless of the outcome, the data will be misconstrued and manipulated. In the words of another, in completing the cards, he said, I feel as though I am having to prove I'm not a racist after every traffic stop. And that's in a quote. And I'll just say to the officer, no, that's not the case. It's called accountability. So in an effort to avoid being characterized as biased, several officers discussed instances where they chose not to submit a stop card following a stop involving minority drivers, or they mislabeled the driver's race, ethnicity on the stop card. So if it was a black person, he might have put others or something like that. Now, Chief Zimmerman said in the Union Tribune that statistics are a great piece of evidence, but not the only piece of evidence. She said, they don't necessarily tell the entire story. And that's in the quote. And I would just say that the other evidence that we have is our experiences. You know, when police officers follow you for 12 blocks, 14 blocks, and pull you over for your license plate light is out. They don't give you a ticket or anything else, but they ask if you're on probation, they want to search your car, and things like that. People begin to feel they're being targeted. When officers follow you all the way home to your doorstep, when they follow you and watch where you're going and so on, those type of things make you feel as though you've been targeted because of your race. And so it's what especially young black men are experiencing that is causing them to have this attitude of their reality, and that is they feel like they're being racially profiled. So, but you know, Zimmerman also acknowledged, however, that there remains a perception in parts of the community that minorities are more likely to be pulled over and mistreated by police after getting stopped. And as I mentioned before, it's not a perception, it's actually a reality. It's a world that black and brown folks live in. So what the San Diego PD has to realize is it's not just a perception, it is a reality. Especially blacks being mistreated by law enforcement. In addition, I believe law enforcement has a perception that blacks automatically don't like them, which is not true. In the SDSU audit data electronic survey of the department, when they surveyed the police department, they asked officers to assess whether they believe various racial ethnic groups feel comfortable interacting with the San Diego Police Department. Just over a third, that's 38.8% of officers who responded to the survey strongly agreed that blacks feel comfortable interacting with the San Diego Police Department. So that's a perception too. And that's compared to when you saying that non-black citizens, when they surveyed them, they said 61.5% believe Hispanics feel comfortable, 80% believe Asians feel comfortable when they're talking to them, and 87.5% believe, these are officers believe that whites feel comfortable interacting with San Diego Police Department. And so we've got to understand that it's deeper than, if you're going to talk about perception, it's on both sides, and you're going to talk about the issue, you have to look at it from both angles, because not all black people have a problem with law enforcement, but they do have a problem with their safety and feeling like they're being racially profiled. So the data also reported on their cards that these officers spoke out about the race ethnicity out of place approach. And what is that? In which officers deliberately target individuals whose race, ethnicity does not fit the dominant demographics of the area. Officers readily offer examples of this, such as stopping a white person in predominantly black area of the Southeastern Division, or a black person in the majority white area, such as La Jolla. As one officer candidly noted, I'm not going to lie. If I see somebody that's totally out of place and there's a reason to stop them, I'm going to stop them and ask them what are they doing. I mean, I'm being truthful. Unfortunately, it sucks It's not like I'm trying to, end of quote. Most other officers, however, deny using race ethnicity in this way. So before we bring it to our discussion, Pastor Ben McBride, who we have holding on the line with us, I just want to read a brief of his bio, and here it goes. Ben is a native of San Francisco and a longtime activist for peace and justice with a history of spiritual leadership, serving multiple congregations across the Bay Area. In 2008, Ben relocated his family to a difficult neighborhood in Oakland known as the Q Zone. This positioned him to gain firsthand understanding in order to intelligently respond to the epidemic of gun violence. During this tenure, he also served as executive director of City Team, a Christian nonprofit providing rescue and recovery, medical and financial, educational, and spiritual opportunities to hurting and homeless Oakland residents. In 2012, Ben was an instrumental component in relaunching the first successful iteration of Operation Ceasefire, a data-driven communication strategy to reduce gun violence. Operation Ceasefire strategy has contributed heavily to a near 40% reduction in homicides over the last 4 years. As a result of Ben's zeal for social improvement and judicial restructuring, Ben founded the Empower Initiative in 2014. Empower provides faith-based technical assistance concerning public safety and training for religious community members around the intersection of race and faith. So, and you can read some of the other pieces that are left on our Facebook page and so on. But we're going to, at this time, we're going to bring Ben into discussion very briefly, and then we're going to go to a commercial. So, Mr. McBride, Pastor McBride, welcome to What's Happening Now, and thank you for being on the show. How you doing?
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yes, it's great to have, good to have you. So we're gonna take a break for about, I think, 2 minutes, and then we'll be right back. So stay on the line with us, Pastor McBride, and we'll be right back in 2 minutes.
San Diego's news source for R&B, KBLK.
All right, welcome back to What's Happening Now on KBLKradio.com, and thank you for staying with us. And we have Pastor Ben McBride on the line with us. And during the break, because we have live streaming with our Facebook audience, we were talking about the audit report and just looking at some things. So one of the things that I did want to ask Pastor McBride, when you read through this report regarding the San Diego stops, and do you have any other thoughts that you would like to add regarding the audit report?
Sure. Well, I think one of the things that the report is displaying, it's displaying something that we're seeing across the state, across the nation, but I think certainly in San Diego, what it's demonstrating is that the officer's discretion is being informed out of their racial bias. Now, that racial bias can either be explicit or implicit, but irrespective of that, it is inherently damaging to those of us whose skin color that we have is now being criminalized because of the implicit or explicit bias that is being being made actionable by law enforcement. And so the data surely proves that law enforcement officers are both stopping people of color and that we are walking away, based on you all's report, walking away without a crime being attached to us, even without being cited, which is clearly demonstrating that we're being stopped without cause. And until law enforcement leaders in San Diego are willing to really begin to listen to community and make some commitments around how they're going to address this bias, both through training and through community-led solutions, we really are not at a place that we can have any kind of, forward conversations.
Right. So now, what is your experience in dealing with racial profiling?
So my personal, experience with racial profiling, the only gun I stared down is that of a police officer in San Francisco when I was growing up at 18. My brother was racially profiled and beat up by the police while in college. And this has been a cycle that has been going on throughout my life. And it's for that reason that many of us, engaged in organizing and advocacy to find ways to push back on these challenges that we've seen. And just as recently as a couple of weeks ago, there was a viral video that went, across the nation, where I came upon a black woman in the Bay Area who was being racially profiled by the police, and we had to stand up and resist against that kind of injustice. So racial profiling is impacting us on a daily basis. Oftentimes, it's going around in our communities unheard and unreported, and we're going to have to recognize that this is not okay, and that we're going to have to organize ourselves together and call our systems to be accountable to us, considering we are the ones that pay their salary.
Amen. Amen. You know, I saw a video of you that went viral, confronting, this was in Richmond, right? Confronting a Richmond, California police officer.
Right.
Got in trouble. Now, what was that all about?
Yeah, so I actually came to the meeting that night to try to be of some support and comfort to a lot of our immigrant sisters and brothers who were very concerned about this Trump presidency. Right. And as I came upon the scene, there was a black woman who was hysterically crying, and her vehicle was being searched, and she was up and down off of the sidewalk and in tears begging the officer not to tow her vehicle. When we first started, there was a couple other community members who were engaging the officer, asking, can she just receive a citation so that she's able to go home? She was talking about how her family members have medical conditions, and she herself had a visible disability. It was obvious that she was recovering from a stroke. Right. And this white police officer used absolutely no discretion, but rather was demonstrating himself to come across in a very smug way, in a very cynical way, making faces, smiling at the community members. And when the video picks up after at least 10 minutes of us trying to be cordial and trying to appeal to the officer's humanity, where then at that point, with his smugness and his cynicism, I began to critique him and call him to recognize that he had failed his community, and to also help the community to recognize that when we see one another in trouble, we should not stand by idly, but we should find ways to stand with one another.
Wow. And what kind of response did you get from the police officer in this encounter?
So as he stood there, one of the things that I recognized by nature of having trained and learned about the law enforcement structure, which this is something that's very important for us, because I don't think we can challenge systems unless we understand the systems. Right. I knew what it is that I could do and could not do that would limit his ability to say that I was posing a threat. So I stood in the same place without moving my body position. I lifted up my voice in critique, and the officer couldn't do anything, even though his face was pulsating. He was turning red. It was becoming obvious that, he wanted to do something, but I refused to give him that option. So he had to just stand there and listen. He moved around. He tried to start talking to other community members to see if he could turn one of the community members against me. And I just continued to lift that up and talk with our community members. And subsequently, one of the more discouraging things was the next week we came to city council with the woman after we helped get her car out of the tow. We came with her to city council to talk with them about their need to change policing practices in the city of Richmond. And the Police Officers Association showed up and actually lambasted and critiqued the disabled woman, saying that she obviously wasn't poor since she was driving such a nice vehicle.
Wow. So I'm assuming that the officer was not disciplined. There was no apologies or anything in regards to that of them taking her car.
No apologies, no sense of trying to help rectify the situation. And this is the kind of critique that we were, putting on the heads of the police department as well. We used some of our connections that night to call into the police chief's office and others and ask them, as they say that they're in partnership with community, ask them to intervene in what was becoming an obvious, unjust, non-compassionate situation. They refused to display the moral courage. And so it was left on us as community members to stand up for one another. And that's why I really believe it's very important for us to no longer allow those who choose to serve in a public role to not be responsible to both, what it is that the expectations that we as community members are saying we want from them.
Right. Wow. So now, can you explain to us what procedural justice is and why it's important for law enforcement to be trained in it and practice it? Because it sounds like this issue that we just experience, if they understood procedural justice, they would not have treated the woman like that.
Absolutely. And this was actually part of the conversation I was saying to the officer that night. There is a concept that came from a sister, a black woman out of Yale, Dr. Tracy Mears, an academic theory that she calls procedural justice. It was adopted in the 21st Century Policing Report by the Obama administration. And in essence, what it lifts up is that if law enforcement commits itself to a certain kind of ethos, a certain way of being with respect to community members, that they will have more legitimacy, that their role and their practices will have more legitimacy.
Right.
But when they don't, implement procedural justice, they lose legitimacy in the community. And regardless as to the badge or a shield on their chest, if you're not seen as legitimate by the community, then you have no legitimacy.
Right.
And the 4 tenets of procedural justice are voice, respect, trustworthiness, and neutrality. Voice, that law enforcement officers should always be finding ways to give the community voice, hearing what the community wants to say and how they want to see things change. Respect.
Right.
And law enforcement, the number one question they should be leaving every interaction going, how did I ensure that I committed the respect to the individual, regardless of the situation? Neutrality. Right. They should show up impartially, and checking their bias and finding ways to ensure that no existing bias is informing the action that they're doing. And then trustworthiness. They should be using transparency, not just with the person they're interacting with, but the larger community, and ensuring that they're showing everyone how the whole process is happening above board. If that officer would have done that night, he would not have towed her vehicle, because he obviously would have seen that there were multiple factors in place that did not necessitate him towing her vehicle.
Right. Right. And I think that's one of the key components that I don't think the audit report really talked about, and I think that when they talk about perception, they don't understand that it grows deeper than a perception. Even when we're stopped for legitimate reasons out here, it's the attitude and how that officer treats you during that process. There have been times that I've been pulled over and I knew I was guilty. I was speeding. An officer pulled me over. And so nice, and treated me so nice and so well to where I thought he wasn't going to give me a ticket, But then there's been other times where I have been pulled over and, for a legitimate stop, tail light out or something like that, and they got to get smart. They want to ask folks on probation in the car. Then they keep you there for 20, 30 minutes. You ask a question, well, what's taking so long? Just sit there and be quiet and wait. So those type of attitudes kind of make you start thinking, looking at law enforcement in a negative way. So they have to understand that it's not just the stop and because you got a legitimate reason to stop me, but it's how you treat me after you stop me.
Absolutely, because law enforcement must understand that their story sits inside a larger container of the historical and generational effects of policing on particularly people of color and religious minorities, and that their occupation, their vocation, has been used historically under the law to actually enforce racism, enforce xenophobia and fascism, and racial violence and terror. And so if they want to redeem themselves and redeem their vocation, then they must recognize that the elements of procedural justice, voice, respect, neutrality, and trustworthiness, that these elements must absolutely change the way that they police. And we argue with police executives that they must use these kinds of descriptors to also think about how they promote through the department, so we don't end up with tenured officers who really are teaching the younger officers how to implement some of the same biased racial characteristics that we've seen over the last 30 to 40 years.
Right. Because a lot of time when we talk about training the new officers that come in, when they come through the academy, and then when they get out on the field, it's one thing to train them before they get out on the field, but then if that officer that's going to train them a whole nother different kind of way that goes against what we want as procedural justice, then it creates a larger problem for us. And I think that's why, officers need to be trained also. But one of the things I was always told is that law enforcement will not receive training from community members if it's based on implicit bias. Have you heard anything like that?
We have heard pushback. I mean, the training that we did in Oakland, where myself and cadre of other community leaders retrained our law enforcement officers around procedural justice, we implemented a component of implicit bias, but there was even hesitancy of law enforcement officers to have communities participate in that.
Yes.
One of the things that we really have to keep pushing as community members is that there is precedence now for law enforcement officers. So we need to be pushing on the law enforcement executives of San Diego. There is precedence in California for community members to be retraining the law enforcement officials. And why would they not? Why would those who are most impacted by law enforcement not be given the agency to actually train these agencies on how we want them to show up in our communities? There is hesitancy a lot of times from the police officer associations.
Right.
And these are just, some fights that we're going to have to take up, because at the end of the day, our lives are on the line. Some people ask me, weren't you concerned, in the video, what if the officer would have jumped on you?
Right.
What I've been pushing on people saying, the wrong question is, what would have happened to me if the officer would have jumped on me? The right question is, what could have happened to our sister if I would not have intervened?
Right, exactly. Then that would have been another bad experience, which she did have a bad experience with law enforcement. And, this creates a negativity. And one of the things I think people don't realize when we talk about the negativity that happens, towards law enforcement is that it traumatizes a whole family, traumatizes the whole community. So when you sharing the story, and when we see it on video, and when we hear about it, and if I know this person, they share it, then it kind of traumatizes me too, and causes me, even if I have never ever had a negative experience with law enforcement, it causes me to start having that experience also. Unless there's some positive reinforcement where I said, well, there's a lot of good police officers out there, and I had some good experiences with them, so this must just been a bad police officer. I really wish, that's the way we could think based on how we're treated. You know what I mean? But most of the time, the good officers or a good person that's an officer tends to be the exception to the rule versus the other way around. We know that there's a lot of officers out there that love their job and love to serve and are not deliberately racist, but when you talk about implicit bias, they do have that implicit bias. And when you buy into what they argue about racial profiling and say is criminal profiling. Well, yeah, of course it's criminal profiling, but it's after you have criminalized communities of color. Once you criminalize us, then you can go in and say you're criminally profiling. So, you're dealing with a person look like a gang member. Well, I'm criminally profiling, but you can't. What does a gang member look like? When I was banging you, there was times I dressed up. You couldn't tell if I was a gang member or not. So what does a gang member look like? Is it because he's black and he's young, or because he's Latino and he's young, or is it something else that you're looking for? So they don't realize that they in their culture, they feel they're not targeting you because you're black, but they're targeting you because of crime. But at the same time, there's a lot of young black and brown men that have been targeted that felt like it was unjust. Even if I'm a gang member, if I'm not really doing anything or bothering anybody, why are you bothering me? So, and that's the attitude that's out there in the community. So, now, have you ever had any training sessions with the San Diego Police Department or any law enforcement agency in San Diego County with the training and the work that you do?
Not yet, but one of the things that we did do was present an opportunity to several San Diego County law enforcement agencies a couple months ago in September, inviting them to really start thinking about how they can partner with the community and implement some of the best practices that have been going on across the state of having community-led instruction and solution tables that actually bring in those who are most concerned about the dynamic between communities of color and police and be a part of learning and listening from what community leaders are saying and implementing their solutions. We've begun to put that word out coming into next year. We're actually are going to be looking to resource and help support multiple organizations to find ways to do this. So the opportunity, it has been put out there. We'll continue to float it out there for San Diego County law enforcement agencies. I think it is upon us as community members in San Diego for us to keep the heat on our law enforcement agencies and be pushing them to implement strategies informed by us around hiring, around equipment, around accountability, and around training if they want to rebuild or build a relationship with impacted communities. So the opportunity's been put out there. It's going to be upon San Diego law enforcement community, both the sheriffs, the local police agencies, and surrounding cities, to take a step into the crosswalk, meet the community, and find ways, well, with shared agency and power, for us to create a story that we both want to belong to.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Man. That. Wow. Now I just want to say to our Facebook viewers that are we're live streaming. You know, we're talking with Pastor Ben McBride out of Oakland, and we're dealing with racial profiling and the traffic stops, and dealing with the report that came out by the San Diego State University audit they did on the data cards that police officers use in traffic stops. And so we're talking about that, but we're talking about racial profiling in general, and trying to move to some solutions in regards to what can we do to reduce these traffic stops that we feel are unjust, and also prevent it, and where we can build healthy communities and build bridges between community and law enforcement. So if we have viewers out there that are listening on the radio or on the line, you can call 619-356-4705 if you want to join in on the conversation. Again, that is 619-356-4704. And we thank all of you all for viewing and watching us. And please join the conversation. Give us a call and join in with us on this. So, Pastor McBride, I wanted to ask you, do you think it would make a difference if the San Diego Police Department acknowledged the existence of racial profiling in their department? Because I from listening to Ron Villa from the mayor's office and listening to Chief Zimmerman, it sounds like, I don't know, we have to wait till Wednesday, but it sounds like they're still trying to justify or get around the notion of what the report said in regards to acknowledging that racial profiling exists. And I don't know what it's going to take to get them to acknowledge that. But do you think it'll make any difference?
Well, I do. I think it's an important statement and an important display of leadership that they need to demonstrate. They have to stop trying to be ahistorical and talk about a conversation about crime in communities of color that somehow have no connection to the racially unjust, system of mass incarceration and the criminalizing of communities of color that have led into this dynamic. And so, because law enforcement agencies describe themselves as a paramilitary organization, it is of great consequence when the law enforcement leader will stand up and say, I recognize that we have an issue with racial profiling. Right. We want to work with community members to find out how we can best remedy that, and we're open to solutions, and we want to start on that journey. That sends a clear message across their department that says everyone is on notice to recognize that we have identified an issue that our community is raising, and the data is backing up, and we are going to be committed to resolving it. Right.
And we talked a little earlier, because you did go through the report and everything, and it sounds like, they even, at least from what I've heard thus far with law enforcement and the mayor's office, that they're trying to say that the report didn't said there were no disparities. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't know how they read that, because
I don't either.
The report clearly said that blacks were being stopped more frequently than their white counterparts. It took into evaluation the reality of visibility during the day versus night stops, and even focused a lot of its data evaluation on that twilight hour. And so there was great specificity to actually pull data that would inform the solutions. We had a data report very similarly out of Stanford University here in the Bay Area, Oakland, that identified racial profiling as well. Now, our law enforcement leaders admitted that there was racial profiling, and some of that they had to do because they were under, a the oversight order by the federal government. But I do believe that they need to listen to the data. If you won't listen to those of us in the community, and you won't listen to an independent evaluator who has nothing to gain, at a certain point we have to start asking ourselves the question, are you prepared to hear the truth or not, or are you only committed to what you see as the truth?
Exactly. And that's I see that's part of the problem, because when I read the response from the mayor's office, and I believe it's Ron Villa, whoever it was that gave the response for the city of San Diego and the police department, it sounds like, they're trying to defend themselves. And I'm like, okay, why are you trying to shred apart this audit report when you're the one that's asked for it? And that's very true, because one of the things that I've always been saying to law firms, they get mad at me because we're supposed to have a relationship and work together. But when you critique them, or when you tell them what community members are complaining about, they get a little upset with you because they think you're taking sides, and you're supposed to be on their side. And as far as with me, I'm on the right side, whatever the right side. I'm about righteousness. I'm not about taking sides. You know what I mean? So if a community member is wrong, we'll let them know, community member, they're wrong. If police wrong, we got to let them know that they're wrong. And, but it seems like, when you deal with them, they tore apart the report. At least from what I've read, they're trying to defend themselves, and it's almost as though, and then they find little snippets in the report to try to say, oh, there's no disparity here, there's no disparity here, but the overall report did show that, no, there were some disparities, and blacks and brown in 2014, 2015 their cars were searched and they were stopped more than the blacks, than whites and Asians. And so we do have a problem. What do you think is the most effective kind of community policing?
Well, I do think that if we can create systems that that distinguish what kinds of public safety responses are needed in certain scenarios, then we'll be in a much better position. For example, domestic disturbances where there are challenges happening based on familial relational breakdowns need more of a social welfare response than a criminal force response. If violence is not being involved in a scenario, we don't need to be injecting individuals who don't have a social welfare background, who are armed, into scenarios that don't require these kinds of dynamics. And we also need to start paying attention to who the data is telling us is that are able to provide public safety without using violence. And what a lot of the early reports are showing is that both women, LGBTQ sisters and brothers, and non-military background folks are able to contribute public safety without using force at a much higher rate than, both white and black males, and particularly those from a military background. So I think we need to change who we have. We need to change the amount of training that they have. We need to augment the kind of equipment and responses and tactics. And we've got to have community oversight commissions that actually have power to hire and fire police officers and police executives, so that we can have a true system of checks and balances, if this is supposed to be a democracy, which people keep telling me that it is.
Right. Land of the free.
Right.
But, okay, and I know you do a lot of trainings and so on, and I saw a presentation that you did, and it was real good presentation that you do with law enforcement. Now, with your presentations and so on, how can we get, like, a city here, San Diego, to engage in and get involved in that, the trainings that you're doing?
Right. So the training is called Principled Policing. I encourage everyone to Google Principled Policing. And what will bring you up is the Department of Justice website, where myself, along with academics from Stanford, some law enforcement folks, put together a training that is now available for law enforcement agencies across the state, certainly in San Diego, where there's actually also money available to that local police department. San Diego Police Department and the county county departments have access to this training and resources to actually implement and put in a training team in their city. If they don't do it, it is simply because they lack either the political will or the concern to implement these trainings, but the training is very much focused on changing the dial for officers around the treatment that they need to lean into with respect to community, and it's very much focused on understanding the historical and generational effects of policing and understanding how implicit bias not just plays a role inside policing, but a role inside the larger society. But because they are police officers and have the power under the law to take away people's life and freedom, it means that we've got to have a different level of accountability for them. The principal policing training is open and available to San Diego, and it's just upon the mayor, it's upon the police, law enforcement apparatus to access the resources and implement the training.
Right. So when we talk about this, what do you think is the greatest hurdle the community and law enforcement, we talk about here in San Diego, will have to get through in order to build trust between each other?
Well, I think one of the biggest challenges, first I'll start from the community side. And I think, the fact that we have experienced injury and we have experienced, centuries of oppression and challenge, I think it is hard for a lot of us to even imagine a world where we would not have an adversarial, response to law enforcement in our communities. And I think that, one of the things that we must continue to challenge ourselves with is to have the imagination to see the future and to actually conceptualize a world where we could have a reasonable and maybe even a vibrant relationship with a public safety system that we really believe is authentic and can keep our community safe, that we have no problem complying to. So I do think that us as community members, we must come to the table. I think the more we stay away from the table, the more we allow ourselves to only live in our pain and in our challenge, and we're actually not building something for the future generations. And so we are only where we are because of generations before us building. I think we need to make sure that we're building. And for law enforcement, I think what we need is we must have some moral leaders that are law enforcement executives that are willing to meet community.